What do you get when you add a rat and a roguelike together?
A game jam.
This week I want to talk about the trials and tribulations I faced on my first game jam. Join along as I share my story of how I created a winter-themed roguelike game while battling the craziness of a full-time job. So get ready for an adventure of a lifetime, and let's get started. Our story begins in January of 2020. My friends and I were thinking about a couple of projects we wanted to work on, and we really just wanted to experiment making some games. We had always played around with the idea of maybe doing a game jam sometime, so I felt like this was the perfect opportunity for us to host a little game jam and just have fun creating a couple games without there being any pressure whatsoever. We also decided that we should make it winter themed because I live in Ohio and there's snow practically everywhere all the time. So I thought it was fitting, and so we decided to call it the Great Winter Game Jam. The rules were pretty simple. The game had to be winter themed at some level, whether it was Christmas or just snowmen battling outside. And the game had to have top-down movement with no more than 10 levels. So we had our theme, an idea, we put it on itch.io, and we were excited because this was the first time we've ever done a game jam. Now I know what you're thinking, we probably should have joined someone else's game jam before we made our own. And you know what I say to that? Something terrible is about to happen. So my friends and I went into our own little elf workshops and started thinking of ideas for some games. I actually made 2 games for this jam. And I don't know why, and I've noticed that this has happened to me ever since I've done this game jam, but I always start out using the majority of my time trying to make this massive game. So my first attempt at the game was going to be a Earthbound kind of themed RPG, and the protagonist was going to be this little elf character that looks surprisingly familiar. I have to say, I actually had a blast working on this project, and I made a lot of music that was really new and different for me, and I thought the soundtrack was very compelling and interesting. But the problem was, I was trying to make this epic RPG for a small game jam, and that was not the purpose. So, as quickly as I came up with this idea, I had to put my elf game on the shelf and go back to the drawing board and think of something different. At this point in time, I had a revelation. An idea came down from heaven, and I thought, what if I make a game about rats? Now, you may be asking, what does rats have to do with winter? And my answer is, I have no idea. I just wanted to do it, and I thought maybe I can make it like this winter dungeon that this rat is going through, and his goal is to find this ancient cheese wheel to help the cheese factories stop from being frozen over. My thought is that if this rat is going through this dungeon, then there's only one type of game that I can make, and that's a roguelike. Now, before you go into the comments and correct me that, oh, technically it's a roguelite. I know, I'm getting there. The difference between a roguelike and a roguelite is very different. One is a game that's based off of a dungeon crawling game called Rogue, while others have qualities of roguelikes with procedural generation or permadeath. Spelunky or The Binding of Isaac is a good example of those. Another reason I wanted to do a roguelike is I wanted to cheat the 10-room rule for the game jam. I thought I can just do procedural generation in the same room and it never has to change. That way I could have as many rooms as I want, infinite, and technically it wasn't breaking the rules because it was all still in the same room. So feeling inspired, I jumped right in to this new gaming adventure. Starting off, I had to think about the main object. How did the player get to the next room in the dungeon to get all the way down to the bottom? And I played around with it back and forth. Maybe you had to kill all the enemies. Maybe a door randomly spawned. Or maybe you could break pots or kill enemies and there was a key that would be dropped. And if you pick up that key, you could use it to open the door. I thought that could be an interesting approach because you don't always have to fight the enemies. If you break a pot and the key appears, then you can just avoid the enemies and save up your health. Or you could purposely try to stick around and fight everything to save up money. Of course, money needed to have some sort of significance, so I thought, what if a shop appeared every 3 to 6 floors? You never knew when it was going to appear, so your goal was just to grind up as much money as possible while still keeping your health. And in typical roguelike fashion, if you died, the game was over. I also spent a little bit of time trying to think through what I should do for the visuals, and I realized I didn't want a lot of time making artwork because I would need that time to think through the procedural generation and the enemy AI. So I decided to go with a monochromatic 7x7 grid. That way the inner artist in me wouldn't come out and I would have to redo stuff over and over and over again, which is exactly what I did with the Elf game. So with my basic blueprint, I started creating the game in Construct 3. At the time, I was actually really busy with work, and I didn't have a whole lot of free time to work when I got home. I ended up carrying a sketchbook with me all the time, and if I had ideas, I would either write it down, or I would write it down on my phone. And that way, I already kind of could think through what needed to be done, and the mechanics of it, so when I actually sat down to program it, it was fairly quick. So after completing the procedural generation, I fervently worked on my game every single day so I could complete it before the deadline. I created a menu for my game, I added a working shop, I made it that the enemies would actually follow you if you were in their line of sight. I also added it for every 10 floors that the color palette, the tiles, and the enemies would change, making the game harder as it went on. I wanted to add multiple endings to the game, and even different characters that you could play. I also thought it'd be cool if there was different items that you could find throughout the dungeon and have different types of enemies. But the problem was I was running out of time and I didn't really have that much time to work on the game in the first place. So I decided not to give in to the scope creep and just to publish my game the way it was. I spent the last day of the jam working on some of the branding for the itch.io page. I thought it'd be fun if I called the game Squeaks and Squalls, kind of playing off the rat theme and the winter, and I submitted the game with barely any time to spare. Overall, I'm really happy with how Squeaks and Squalls turned out. It was really exciting to work in a genre that I had never done before. I also was really proud of myself for finishing the game when I was super busy at work. It's really easy for us to get distracted with life, whether you're at school or whether you're working full time, or whether you just don't feel like making anything. And it always feels so good to just finish something and accomplish a goal. And that's why I think game jams are great. Is Squeaks and Squalls a polished game? Definitely not. But I always have the opportunity to go back and improve things if I want. But it just feels good for me that I actually finished something that I said I was going to do, and I did it in a short amount of time. If you're interested in playing Squeaks and Squalls, it's currently up on my itch.io page. I believe it's only a Windows download, but maybe I can eventually put up a web version. And if you're interested in joining a game jam, my studio Fearth is actually hosting our second annual Great Winter Game Jam. It's unranked and it starts December 1st. It's going to be a blast, and I'm going to be playing every single one of your guys' submissions. So thanks so much for watching this video. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. our Discord if you just want to join the community and talk to other game devs. It's awesome, it's great, and I always have great conversations with people on there. So thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next week for another game dev adventure.
Good man.
Total battle. Play in your browser.
Упс. Ну ты же помнил, хоть не.
Играй в War Thunder. Присоединяйся к миллионам игроков в самом масштабном онлайн-экшене всех времен.
Радостно, тихо.
In my last video, I talked about some of the new features coming with Blender. To show off the power of geometry nodes, I made this simple particle system animation, which distributes glowing mushroom spores all over a mesh based on an empty object. Loads of people ask for a tutorial on this effect. I know that most of you have no experience with geometry nodes, so you can think of this as a bit of a crash course. I know it looks a bit intimidating, guys, but trust me, I'm an idiot. I spent like one day and leave this set to float. We can set a minimum and a maximum scale value. We can also play around with all the other values we've made until everything looks good. Once you've got something that you're happy with, we need to tell Blender to increase the total scale based on the distance that the object is from the empty. We can calculate the distance using an attribute vector math node. What this node basically does is it takes two vectors or two attributes, it performs a math operation on them, and then it spits out the result as a new attribute. So we're going to need the position of our points in 3D space. That's an attribute of this object, so we can just type in position and Blender will grab that information. Then we're going to need the position of the empty in 3D space. That isn't an attribute, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the object info node and we're going to use the eyedropper to select the empty. So now what we can do is we can get the location and plug that in. But the location, as we mentioned earlier, is a vector, right? It's 3 numbers, 3 coordinates. So we need to just change the type to vector. Now we just need to change the calculation type to distance. I'm going to rename the result of this calculation distance. So now Blender has an attribute in it called distance, which is the distance between the empty and the points. So we can add a new node into this thing, which is an attribute math node, not an attribute vector math node. It's an attribute math node.
Обманывать это сложно. Самообманывание. Лень и недомышленность, собственно. Персон. Ну ладно. Время теряешь, просто теряешь, да. Теряешь, да. Не на КПД, да. Ни на что так, что хорошо тебе и людям было. Да. Много еще надо выбрать. Понимаете, да. Ну, как будет делать, женщине перепоручение, а что еще там, на их сильные плечи, усатые, мускулистые, да. И голову большую, да. Wow. поел, поел. Вроде как и делать ничего не надо, да, он здесь ставит зажитый. Ладно. Видишь, ты совсем ты смиришься, а что тебе надо-то? Да, понимаю, да. Ну что ты, ну нет, они тоже могут их посунуть, как бы, да, что сделал, да. Типа того. Ну не знаю, что просто. Или забеременеть хотя бы, да. Обессилить как-нибудь, да, не знаю, как бы понял, ну понимаю. Ну да. Ну, это уже, ну тоже нормально, но это как бы, да,